Welcome to the Intersections of Crime podcast. This podcast is dedicated to connecting the fields of biology, political science, and most importantly, criminology. By exemplifying current research using a high-profile criminal case in each episode, we hope to leave the viewers better informed and interested in the intersectionality of crime.
Randy Stephen Kraft was born on March 19, 1945, in Long Beach, California, to a loving mother and distant father. He had 3 sisters, and by all accounts lived a charmed life, with exception to his clumsiness and the previously mentioned distant father. He was a remarkable student and an aspiring politician throughout middle and high school. He would routinely make A's and would go on to start a World Affairs Club at his high school. High school was also around the time Kraft realized he was homosexual. He graduated 10th in his class in 1963 and would begin a Bachelor's of Arts in Economics at Claremont Men's College that fall. Kraft would begin college as he ended high school, a straight-A student, closet homosexual, and staunch Republican with aspirations to become a senator. He even enrolled in the Reserve Officers Training Corps, attending many pro-Vietnam War rallies. However, he began to drift away from the Republican Party and towards the Democratic Party, declaring himself a liberal and realizing that his republicanisms were a simulation of what his parents wanted. He would also begin working as a bartender and having casual sex with hustlers. However, he would stop this activity when he was arrested for lewd conduct after propositioning an undercover police officer in Huntington Beach. This was his first charge, so the charges were dropped and he was free to go. After this run-in with the law, he became a Democratic Party organizer and was a major help to Robert F. Kennedy's election, to the point where Kennedy sent him a letter of thanks. He would fall out of love with politics, though, and into love with alcohol, drugs, and gambling. He would ultimately fail a crucial class, pushing his graduation back to 1968. Upon graduating, he enlisted in the Air Force, overseeing the painting of test aircraft. He would come out as gay to his family, to rage from his father, and disappointed approval from his mother and sisters. However, his family would come around. His Air Force superiors would not, though, as they immediately discharged Kraft in 1969 when he came out to them. Something shifted in Kraft after this event. In 1970, he lured a runaway 13-year-old boy into his apartment with the promise of shelter and sex with a woman Kraft knew. However, there was no woman. Kraft drugged, beat, abused, and sexually assaulted the boy for hours. The boy would escape when Kraft left for a bartending shift. The boy's disheveled condition attracted attention and ultimately saved his life, as he would have to have his stomach pumped. Police were quick to act, searching Kraft's apartment with consent from his roommate. Kraft would have been stopped before he started, but the boy testified that he ingested the drugs willingly, and the warrantless search of Kraft's apartment would not stand in court. If something had not changed than before, it had certainly changed now, as Kraft would go on to drug, torture, sexually assault, and murder suspected 67 individuals between 1971 and 1983. These individuals ranged from the ages of 13 to 35. The majority of them were in their mid-20s and were Marines. He would ultimately be arrested while disposing of his final kill when 2 California Highway Patrol officers pulled him over for suspected driving while impaired. Despite keeping a scorecard with 63 entries hinting to his victims, Kraft would ultimately be charged with 16 counts of murder, 1 count of sodomy, and 1 count of emasculation, and found guilty on all charges in 1989. Kraft currently awaits his death sentence on death row at San Quentin.
So now that we have a little background on who Randy Kraft is, I wanted to ask you some questions, Weylin.
Sure, go for it.
So, based on your research, can Kraft's societal bonds give us an insight as to why he became a serial murderer and rapist?
Well, before we begin, I want to clarify that there are many reasons beyond social bond theory, politics, and biology for Kraft to become a serial sex murderer. We are simply positing that these are some of the things that could have led to him acting the way that he did. That being said, Kraft started in the hole. His father was distant enough for his attachment bonds to be damaged, despite the fact that his mother and sisters loved him unconditionally. However, the reason why we did not see him break bad until much later in life was likely due to his commitment, involvement, and common values bonds being very healthy. He did very well in school and was as involved as an adolescent can get in the political process. This would carry on into college, where we see educational and political commitment and involvement. The political aspect really helped his common values bond, and he was surrounded by people that believed the same thing that he did.
So, from that alone, a serial sex murderer would be the last thing that you would expect Kraft to become. So, what happened?
Well, Kraft fell out of love with politics. His bond decreased, his delinquency increased, and his bond decreased further until it cycled back around and increased again. Then the bond decreased again, and delinquency increased for a final time, just as Mears and Stratford have hypothesized. We see Kraft switching parties and ideologies in college, but not until after his first run-in with the law. That first run-in was likely brought on by his social bonds weakening. He likely felt distance from his family due to his homosexuality and likely felt distance from his conservative Republican views for that same reason, and for the fact they realized they were never really his to begin with. Therefore, the bond weakened, opening the door for delinquency to increase. He still had enough protective factors, I think, for that first arrest to be a wake-up call. He would then get reinvested in politics with the Democratic Party, becoming so invested to become a Democratic Party leader and getting a letter of thanks from Robert F. Kennedy. However, beyond this, the party never really gave back to him, meaning that the bond started to decrease again, causing his delinquency, this time alcohol, drugs, and gambling, to increase again. He would cast aside politics and supplement the need for that sort of bond with a military career that would ultimately be taken away from him due to his homosexuality. Along with this, his relationship with his family would never be the same after he came out to them, even when they came to terms with it. So, now his bonds with politics are broken, his bond with the military is shattered, and his bond with his family is strained. In this scenario, the only thing that could have saved him was the military letting him stay or his return to politics. This return was unlikely, though, given how dejected he likely felt once the military discharged him. In fact, it is possible that he chose mainly the Marines as his victims as a way to get back at the military. In my opinion, this points to disenchantment, where the idea the government is not working in your favor, an idea that can kill any bonds one has with a government entity. Okay, so we've talked about Kraft's politics and societal bonds. Hannah, I was wondering if you can expand upon the Kraft case from a biological perspective.
Absolutely. So what would you like to know?
Well, maybe you could start with the brain scans that Kraft underwent.
Of course. There are two kinds of brain scans I want to focus on for this case. First is the EEG, or electroencephalogram. An electroencephalogram measures electrical activity in the brain. They use the little metal discs, which are electrodes, and attach them to the scalp.
Yes, I've seen those before.
Yeah, so it's regularly used form of imaging. The second kind I want to talk about is PET scans. So PET scans stand for positron emission tomography. A PET scan helps to visualize blood flow, regional chemical composition, and absorption using chemicals known as radiotracers. The reason I want to talk about these two scans is that Kraft's EEG and PET scans show us a bit of different pictures.
How so?
Well, Kraft's EEG scans showed no abnormalities.
Really?
Adrian Rain, a neurocriminologist at the University of Pennsylvania, examined Kraft's brain scan and determined that he has good frontal lobe functioning. Something to keep in mind with this conclusion, and Rain mentions this, is that Kraft possessing a high-functioning brain would most likely only benefit him as a killer. It would increase his efficiency and help him to regulate his behavior.
Interesting. So what did Kraft's PET scan reveal?
In 1989, Kraft received a PET scan. In Kraft's death penalty hearing, Dr. Bushbaum, a UC Irvine psychiatric professor, testified that Randy Kraft illustrated abnormalities that could affect emotional, impulsive, and sexual behavior. Dr. Bushbaum also testified that the PET scans can measure deeper into the brain than the EEG, which can give experts a better understanding of the areas that control sexual behavior. So, while both scans give us different information, it may not be conflicting, but rather show us what happens inside Kraft's brain on different levels.
Very, very interesting. So, what could have caused these abnormalities in Kraft's brain?
Well, there are multiple factors that can affect brain development and therefore behavior, some of which we are still uncovering in science. A large component is genetic, though. On a molecular level, certain enzymes play a role in human behavior, so including behaviors that lead to crime. Current research supports the notion that monoamine oxidase A mutations, also known as MALA mutations, are linked to maladaptive levels of aggression. MALA is an enzyme that breaks down chemicals such as serotonin, epinephrine, and norepinephrine. So the MALA gene mutations can lead to the buildup of these neurotransmitters, which can contribute to behavioral problems. Although this strong correlation does exist, what links aggression to the MALA gene remains an enigma.
Are there any theories as to how the MALA gene and aggression are linked?
Yes, so scientists do understand that environment plays a crucial role in this course of genetic mechanisms and predispositions during brain development. What is termed the critical period takes place during postnatal life, so this is really early. And this critical period is signified by increased neurological plasticity, and this means that the environmental influences have a great impact on brain development and maturation. So the flexibility and moldability of neural programming are important mediators of long-lasting behavior after postnatal development. So as such, the critical period lives up to its name. It's critical. One theory is that perhaps the plasticity of the critical period when interacting with negative environmental factors as well as gene mutations has a role in the biological basis of crime.
So you talked a great deal about intrinsic characteristics that could lead to brain abnormalities. But you just mentioned how the environment could negatively impact the brain. What environmental factors should be considered? Maybe give us an example?
Absolutely. So one that scientists have pinpointed is actually adolescent lead exposure.
Really? Lead exposure?
Yes, lead exposure in any dose can be detrimental to humans as it interferes with numerous enzymes inside the cells of organs. Lead also affects the human brain and behavior.
So what can be done?
Once discovered, lead levels in the human body can be tested in the blood.
Gotcha. How would one even be exposed to lead?
Well, there's actually a variety of ways, but lead was used in paints, pipes, gasoline, and cosmetics, among many other products for many decades up until the mid-1970s.
Wow. So they were very, very common.
Indeed, it was all over. Because of its widespread use, the effects were noticeable. Numerous longitudinal studies were conducted to determine the national effect of these products in relation to crime, and there's approximately a 20-year lag between lead exposure and the fruition of criminal outcomes. In one study, leaded gasoline use explained 90% of the 1964 to 1998 variation in violent crime within the United States. So you know about the crime spike in the late 80s and early 90s?
Absolutely.
This crime spike as a whole likely reflects higher 1970s blood levels in products like paint and gasoline, so it's all connected.
Wow. So has this revelation affected criminal cases?
Yes. So, for example, Terry Sopp, a Florida attorney, argued that one of her clients had reduced culpability because of lead exposure. This client, who remains anonymous and unnamed, was serving life for crimes committed when he was 17 in the mid-1990s. He was convicted of armed robbery and murder. For much of her client's youth, he lived around some of Jacksonville's most contaminated lead sites. Sopp argues that this exposure to lead diminished his ability to make sound choices, thus reducing his culpability for the crimes committed. This argument was presented within the past few years, and I personally haven't heard about an appeal decision being made yet. It will be interesting to see if the court thinks this is a viable defense.
Wow, yeah, that definitely needs to be talked about more. Bringing this back to Randy Kraft, does lead exposure or genetic predisposition explain his behavior?
So, in cases like Kraft's, genetic and environmental harms are possible influences for this kind of deviant behavior. Adrian Rain, who I mentioned earlier, brings up an important point that stable upbringing, which Randy Kraft had, as far as we know, points to an uncomfortable truth. Part of what makes psychopathic killers is inherently biological, or rather written into one's chemical composition. So, to hypothesize that Randy Kraft's behavior was a result of genetic abnormalities and potential environmental harms like lead is not unreasonable.
Wow. Well, on that note, I think we'll end it there. Thanks for chatting about Randy Kraft.
Of course.
Thank you all for listening to the Intersections of Crime podcast. Today we covered the case of Randy Kraft, the infamous scoreboard killer. We hope that our podcast was intriguing as much as it was informative and accurate. If you like what you heard today, please check out our first episode where we discussed Darrell Brooks in the context of antisocial behavior and sovereign citizenship.